anyone ever realized uniforms in today's Chinese army or Russian army or Egyptian army seem to be the same as those that we see in Europe and the United States? Why does Saddam Hussein in his army have rank such as colonels or majors or privates or corporals? And why do tanks and airplanes and missiles seem to look the same wherever we go in the world? The answer to that is that people copy European and American designs. Ultimately, that goes back to what? The beginnings of Western civilization in classical Greece. Now, we have no problem delineating the heritage of the Parthenon and its influence on later Western architecture. We all grant that the Iliad or the Odyssey are the foundations for later epic poetry in the West, and indeed the world. But for some reason, we sort of admit or ignore or neglect the role that Greek and Roman warfare have had in creating not just a Western military tradition, but today a global military tradition, a dynamism, so to speak. I'd like to go back to the ancient world, the period around 490 to 480 BC, which we call the Persian Wars. Because after all, we have an existential question. How in the world did a small little peninsula of about 50,000 square miles, with not more than 1.5 million inhabitants, defeat the invasion first of Darius's lieutenants at Marathon and later his son Xerxes' vast armada, the greatest invasion until the Normandy landings in 1944, his invasion of Greece in April of 480 BC. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. They should have fallen and been incorporated as the westernmost province of Persia, and they weren't. And the answer is there was a certain dynamism about Greek warfare. Now, what do I mean by dynamism? It was an ability to translate elements of their culture into military affairs. In other words, their armies and their navies express certain values, certain attitudes about the world beyond them, and that gave them a dynamism that other cultures lacked. What do I mean lacked, or what do I mean by dynamism? It meant that on any given day, a Salamis, a Battle of Gaugamela, the normal criteria that determine whether an army should win or lose a battle, a war, a conflict, did not necessarily apply. What are those normal criteria? Weather, manpower, whether you're fighting at home, whether you're fighting abroad, the presence of a genius like a Hannibal or Genghis Khan, whether your army is suffering from disease, whether it has a lot of food. All of these criteria determine who wins or loses. But if you were a Greek army or you were a Roman army, your system gave you much greater leeway to counteract the other factors that determine victory or defeat. Now, what are those? Well, in the larger culture of Greece in the 5th century, we see the beginning of constitutional government, the beginning of what I would call rationalism. That's the ability to explain natural phenomenon without superstition. So if you see an eclipse or an earthquake, you don't just always say Poseidon did it or Zeus did it, but you try to find a scientific explanation. We see a free market where people are able to buy goods, sell goods according to rules of supply and demand without coercion or interference in a monolithic government. We see an emphasis on individualism, and we see a welcoming of scientific progress. In other words, there are not religious impediments. When somebody in Greece creates superior body armor, a priest does not say, stop. You're challenging the supremacy of Poseidon or Zeus, or more likely Ares. There was a landscape of tolerance, of free speech. People could say what they want, criticize the government. You put all of those factors into the military, and lo and behold, you see something like Marathon, Plataea, Salamis, where the inexplicable follows. A small force that should not win, given its resources, human and natural, defeats an imperial power. Now, how are those played out in the Persian War and the later Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, and the later invasions of Alexander the Great when he landed on the Asian Minor landscape in 334 and perished in 323? His great 11 years in which he dismantled the Persian Empire. Let's go through them one by one and see if they have any relevance to today's question of why the world seems to be Western in the manifestation of its military. One Western armies seem to have better technology. Xerxes' army had wicker shields. They might have some cheap wooden models. They had very primitive chain armor, and the Greeks had bronze plate. They had sophisticated tactics, they had sophisticated strategy, and later they would develop catapults. They copied designs of warships and improved them with triremes. And by the time of Alexander's invasion of Asia Minor, most of the equipment the Macedonians used was superior to Persian equipment. Why was that? It was simply because the rational way of thinking, the inductive method of inquiry, the scientific manner of empiricism led to people in a constant race with one another for profit maybe, for influence, for celebrity, constantly trying to improve military designs in a way that in Persia or Egypt it was frozen and controlled by the state. Another aspect that we don't think about is this idea of solidarity. Greek phalanxes at Marathon, people fought in rank and file, in mass. And they did so in the Roman world as well, and they did so in Alexander's Macedonian army. What do I mean by that? I mean that victory or defeat occurs whether an army stays in rank. Whether one is considered a heroic warrior or a coward is not not based on how many heads he cuts off, how many warriors he kills, but whether he did what? Kept his place and rank. And the result of all that is that very small, compact formations that advance in time and on orders and keep solidarity of rank, they defeat less organized, less closely regulated and controlled bodies of warriors, even if they outnumber a Western army. We see that today. Essential to most of the armies today, when they get a recruit, whether it's in China or Russia or Europe, the first thing they tell them is how to march in time and how to keep in formation. Not that we fight in phalanxes today, but the mentality of regimentation and of orders and a system of command and a system of group solidarity remains from Greek and Roman times. But there's more to winning a battle than having superior technology and having a superior formation or a superior system of solidarity and regimentation. There's also this notion that people are free to object. On the eve of the Battle of Salamis, there was almost a fist fight between the Spartan general Eurybiades and Themistocles because they were arguing over what was the proper strategy to defeat the Persians in the Bay of Salamis. We see the same thing with Caesar's army in Gaul, where people who were of less rank could challenge their imperator and say, you know what, that's a stupid move, or that you should do this. It doesn't mean that people were insubordinate, but in Western armies there's a sense that people can make critiques, there can be a give and take, and there's not Xerxes on a throne at the Battle of Salamis dictating the battle, or Saddam Hussein in one of his many hideouts ordering people what to do. So with this give and take, clumsy as it can be sometimes, messy as it is, there is a refinement of military strategy, that the best idea eventually is diluted or distilled from this consensus. There's other reasons that the Greeks and Romans were so successful. If you apply the rules of capitalism, even proto-capitalism of the ancient world, that is, that economic activity is governed by the market, supply and demand, investment, dividends, the entire apparatus of capitalism, then it's more likely that your army will be better equipped. So when Alexander went into Asia, even though he was thousands of miles eventually from home in Bactria, his system of logistics allowed his army to be better prepared and better supplied every 20 miles per day of his campaign than were the Persians who were fighting on their homeland. When the American army lands in Iraq in winter of 1990, it has more water available to its troops, imported all the way from distant sources, than Saddam does right inside Iraq. When Hernan Cortez marches on Tenochtitlan in 1521, he has more supplies that he can draw on from Veracruz than do the Aztecs themselves. They don't have access to metal breastplates, gunpowder, arquebuses, crossbows. Not only do Cortez's men have superior technology, but they have superior supplies because there's profit for a Spanish galleon captain in landing at Veracruz and making money by selling things to the crown that Cortez will use. So capitalism manifests itself into superior logistics. There's also a more nebulous idea of freedom. Now, I know that most people don't fight by saying, gee whiz, I'm on the battlefield shooting him because he's unfree and I'm free. But there's a notion that the armies of Western powers have a greater degree, not absolute freedom, but a greater degree. Now, some of you say, how can that be true? We don't have a draft today. Well, think for a minute. A professional soldier has rights and responsibilities within the American army or within the Dutch army that a conscript draftee does not in the Iranian or North Korean army. And that tends to express itself ultimately, not in the beginning maybe. When the Chinese crossed the Yalu, they're a very formidable force of conscripts that do what they're told. But ultimately, people who are fighting for freedom, or at least fighting for a freer way of life, tend to be more motivated, and they tend to think that they are more legitimate. And finally, if we look back at some of these wars in the ancient world, it's astounding how critical people can be, how much we hear and read of anti-war sentiment. So when the Athenians fight the Spartans, pick up a play of Aristophanes, such as the Lysistrata or the Acharnians, or a play of Euripides like the Trojan Women, or read of the castigation in Thucydides that's scarcely hid. And you can see that Greeks felt that they were free to say things negatively about the conduct of a war. Same thing is true in Roman society. Even in the imperial period, where we have a greater loss of personal freedom, if you read Tacitus's annals or his history, you can see that there's quite a lot of criticism of Roman foreign policy. Romans come in and make a desert and they call it peace, Tacitus says. Now, how could that be good? How can the Vietnam War protests be good? How can Michael Moore be good? How can criticism by Cindy Sheehan be good? How can castigating Barack Obama during the Libyan adventure be good? Well, they're not always good because they can create massive dissatisfaction and lack of support at home. But the advantages are they usually don't. They either create a sense of legitimacy that the people are behind in a consensual society, the military effort, or they refine the military effort. If Cindy Sheehan and Michael Moore and Sean Penn are saying we sent our troops to Iraq without sufficient body armor, or they didn't have up-armored Humvees, and Secretary Rumsfeld is, fill in the blanks, every type of slur and smear you can imagine, it does have the tendency, before it completely destroys public support for the war, to forcing Secretary Rumsfeld to make a call to tell the military we have to address this. And so the public becomes watchdogs, so to speak, in a free society of military operations. There is a fine line, of course, when they can become counterproductive and become nihilistic, but usually before that they reach that point, their criticism has positive effects. Let me review for a second. What I'm suggesting to you is that most of the world as we see it today practices a conventional type of war and fields conventional military forces that ultimately, if we go back step by step, century by century, we see their origins in classical Greece and Rome. And we can see small countries like northern Italy originally and central Italy originally, and the small Balkan Peninsula, the southern part of it in Greece, exercising military authority way beyond their borders, whether we're talking about the Athenian Empire all the way to the Roman Empire reaching the Euphrates, the Atlantic Ocean, Scotland, and the Sahara Desert, in ways that don't compute given their small landscapes and their relatively small manpower basis. So how does that happen? Where does that dynamism come from? It comes from the transformation of their culture into an ambitious and dynamic military. Does this always happen? More or less it does, but not always. There are people like Hannibal who defeat the Romans for a while. There are the Parthians who cause havoc in the East. There is a fall of the Roman Empire before classical cultures is absorbed and assimilated into Europe. There is the Islamic challenge. There is the destruction of General Custer at Little Bighorn. There is the initial losses in the Zulu War for the British. All of these happen, and at times the West shrinks. They cannot take Jerusalem in the Third Crusade and Fourth Crusade. At times, Ottoman empires are twice at the gates of Vienna. But over time and space, the story of civilization since 2,500 years, the last 2,500 years of it, is the story of gradual ebb and flow, but gradual advance of Western culture. And we usually attribute it to its values, its economy, its superior political system, forgetting that the twin to all of this was a robust and dynamic military, which is an incorporation of and a reflection of Western values. How do you stop a Greek army? How do you stop a Macedonian army? How do you stop a Roman army? How do you stop the Crusaders? How do you stop the British imperial forces in Africa? How do you stop the Americans in Afghanistan and Iraq if they possess a conventional superiority? There are ways to do it for countries, societies, tribes outside the Western paradigm that don't have the same degree of organization, capital, scientific knowledge and expertise, political stability. And what are some of them? Well, the first and most obvious is that you can borrow weapons from a Greek army or a Macedonian army or an American army. Better yet, steal them. Now, think for a minute. The people who shot General Custer and his small band of the 7th Cavalry at Little Bighorn did not make repeating Winchester rifles or Spencer or Henry rifles, whatever they particularly had. They bought them or they stole them. And key here is that you don't have to know the mechanism of a lever-operated firearm to shoot it. Now, of course, you might not shoot it as well. You might not be able to repair it if it's broken. You might not be able to make more of them on your own if you're outside that Western tradition. But it doesn't mean you can't kill somebody on that given day. All of the elements that we see in Iraq today and Afghanistan today, and anywhere the American Army encounters forces that are less well supplied, are mechanisms to use Western technology to defeat it. The AK-47, the Kalashnikov, was a product of Russian military designs using Western military and scientific concepts that were adopted from German arms that ultimately go back to the Western tradition. And yet an AK-47 cannot be designed and built given the limitations within Iraq. The Taliban cannot design an AK-47. They surely can shoot them very well to kill enough Americans. If tomorrow an American is blown up in a tank in Afghanistan, the components of that improvised explosive device will not be made in Kabul or Kandahar or anywhere in Islamabad. There might be a garage door opener, there might be a propane tank, there might be plastic explosive, there might be a radio transmitter, but those elements can be bought on the internet or shipped in or stolen from American storehouses and then recrafted, often using a Western idea like the internet to gain the sufficient scientific information to disseminate and disperse that knowledge. So the West learned over 2,500 years of military practice that often its monopoly on scientific expertise could be dispersed. Look at gunpowder for a second. There's no monopoly in the West on genius. That's a Chinese creation. But it's a Chinese creation among a Mandarin class. Gunpowder, though, although it developed sometime between the 11th and 13th century in China, was never dispersed among the scientific classes, much less the military classes. Once it's stolen and taken back into the West, then it enters the arena, so to speak, of Western capitalism, profit, scientific inquiry, and free criticism. And lo and behold, what do you have? You go through arquebuses to muskets to flints, and every single element of firearms technology, every single improvement, every single breakthrough is a Western phenomenon. Whether we're talking about flints or percussion caps or special types of gunpowder or the emergence of black powder, then smokeless powder or rifled barrels or automatic weapons. And then that end result is what? Dispersed through military, if I could use the word, military parasitism, so that people, whether they're on the frontier of the 19th century or they're on the Hindu Kush today, people outside the West can use Western arms against them. And sometimes they're very effective. That was something the Greeks and the Romans were very aware of. What else can a non-Westerner or somebody who's outside the orbit of Western military dynamism, what else can they do to stop a Western army? Because usually Western armies are outside their own borders and they're meeting enemies far distant from home. One of the things they can do is they can hope that there is no such thing as a unified West. That's one way to check a Western army. For example, right before the Battle of Lepanto in the immediate decade, the Turkish fleet often harbored at Toulon in France. Germans made the cannon that ultimately knocked down the walls of Constantinople. So the idea that all of West stands monolithic is not true. Why was Islam so effective if what I said was largely true, that there was Western military dominance, and even in the Dark and Middle Ages there was a heritage of Roman military superiority? Well, then why was Islamic culture so ascendant? And it was largely because the West was not monolithic in the way Islam was. There were divisions between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, Southern and Northern Europe, and finally Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Protestantism all tore the fabric of Europe apart. If you wanted to check a Western army on the plains of the United States, say around 1861 or 62, the best thing you had going for you was a civil war, where more people were killed in the first day at Antietam probably than all that were lost to Native Americans in 50 years of frontier fighting. The British Army lost more people in the first day of the Battle of the Somme than it had in 100 years of colonial fighting. And so this has been a way, whether they're Romans or Greeks or Franks or Renaissance Italians or Swiss, one of the ways you defeat them is that you enlist the aid of other Western armies or you create division among Western ranks. And it's no secret that one of the most effective things that Saddam was able to do on the eve of the Iraq War was to enlist the aid of Russia and France to vote against the United States at the United Nations and offer them lucrative oil contracts. There is no such thing necessarily as a politically unified West, and the enemies of the West realize that. But there are other reasons and ways and manners that Western armies don't always win, given that they have a superior military tradition. A third is, why not evoke political unrest at home? I don't mean just objecting to the war, but objecting to the war in a particular way, and I would call it an asymmetric way. Western society generally produces goods and services at a greater rate than non-Western societies. And that allows the standard of living for the individual soldier to be far in excess than his tribal counterpart or his non-Western counterpart, which in turn means that if he dies at 30, he gives up a life far more enjoyable than does his opponent. And that means if you're a Macedonian baron and you're on the plains of Gaugamela and your army has only lost 1,500, those 1,500 might be felt more keenly to Alexander than they would be to the peasants that enlisted in the army of Darius III. Think for a minute. In Afghanistan today, an American soldier may be emailing his children back at his 3-bedroom, 2-bath suburban house. He may be a major with a $250,000 college education. He probably has a bachelor's degree. He probably has 2 cars on the garage. Life is pretty good. And yet we are asking him to go 7,000 miles back to the 16th century and fight somebody who might have been one of 12 children, 6 of whom died of disease, and where in a culture where the average age longevity is probably about 40 to 50 years old. In other words, that means that even though an American soldier and a Taliban counterpart, morally speaking, the loss of either one would be the same, they're not interpreted that by their respective societies. We lose 1,000 soldiers in Afghanistan in a month, and that's a natural catastrophe because we're going to be imbued with stories of family and lost dreams and how unfair it would be for any of us to give up life in its prime. And people in Afghanistan might suggest, well, this is a tragedy, but life's been pretty awful anyway with disease and hunger and malnutrition and whatnot. And so this has always been true. The British Army found that it could lose less soldiers in Zululand than could the Zulus. It was a political question, asymmetry. And that's one way that you can really check a Western power. There was a reason why we saw televised beheadings of Americans and Westerners during the Iraq War, and that was to tell the West, you may have more technology, you may have more capital, you may have a superior method of fighting, but we really don't care so much about life or your civilized rules of behavior, and you do. And you do to such a degree that if we keep doing this, you will quit, even though it won't substantially affect your ability to make war. Let me review just for a second. I'm not suggesting that Western arms always prevailed across time and space on every occasion. I'm just suggesting that the way the world is today, the globalized uniformity of the world, the idea of a shared embrace of capitalism, or the desire for constitutional government, our sophisticated technology, which we all sort of accept as Western products. After all, globalization in some ways is a euphemism or a synonym for Westernization. There was a military component to that as well, in two ways. That today's uniformity of military practice reflects the uniformity of politics, culture, science, and ultimately likewise derives from ancient Greece. And more importantly, it was the method by which this heritage was protected. It explains why the Greeks, being very small in number and isolated, and the same being true of the Italians, were able to protect the idea of republican government or advance the notion of scientific inquiry because they had developed a military that otherwise makes no sense, because it was able not only to defend them but to expand their influence throughout the Mediterranean and indeed most of Europe eventually. And that allowed the Western experiment to continue and thrive. Second, I'm not suggesting that there weren't times when the West was not checked. The period of Islamic ascendancy, or the period of the Moguls, or maybe today with the rise of China. Only that, by and large, the story of warfare today, whether we look at the type of weapons that militaries use, the type of organizations that they embrace, or the dominance of Europe and the United States, or a westernized Japan can operate, reflects this shared Western origins. If the United States decides that Iraq or Afghanistan is absolutely critical to its national survival, that it's not an optional war, it has the capital and the technology and the organization to win that war. And an improvised explosive device, even something as sophisticated and ingenious and diabolical as knocking down the two towers, will not prevail in a war. Checking Western military dynamism ultimately is predicated on the idea that the war is not existential. I'll give you one example in the Middle East. Israel fights a series of 4 or 5 wars with its Arab and Palestinian opponents, whether we go back to 47 and 48, 56, 67, 73, 82, 2006. And it wins a tactical victory, but it very rarely transforms that into ultimate strategic dominance. It's not able to, because it's not able to win or lose without being restricted. But we all know that in 1973, had Israel wanted to annihilate the Egyptian Third Army in the Sinai, it could have done so. We all know that in the 2006 war, if it really wanted to annihilate Hezbollah in Lebanon, it could have done so. But there were political considerations, there were moral considerations that precluded the ultimate expression of Israeli power. But more importantly, they didn't consider them existential threats. However, if 60 to 70 million people in Iran and their government decide they want to destroy Israel, and they send a nuclear missile into Israel, I don't think anybody has any doubt that a far more westernized Israel will destroy Iran, because it was an existential threat and there will be no impediments to the expression of that dominance. And I'll leave you with this paradox, that as the technology in the West gets more and more sophisticated and reaches the stratosphere, and we're going to start to see weapons that are far more deadly even than traditional hydrogen and atomic weapons and biological weapons of the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And as the world becomes more westernized and homogenized and uniform, then it seems to me that the likelihood of war will increase, and the likelihood that it will be expressed in Western terms will increase, and the likelihood that it will be very devastating will increase. And so that's something we very much should be concerned about, that the ultimate expression of scientific dominance, organizational adaptability, cultural ingenuity in the West will manifest itself in the battlefield, and we will all be Westerners, and we will all be very lethal in the manifestation of that very fact. A very scary thought indeed.